Justice comes in all forms, and sometimes the most unlikely hero can be the one who exposes the darkest truths. What happens when a young black boy uncovers a horrifying secret about a wealthy family's nanny? This story will leave you speechless. Malik had always known that his world was different from the one next door. At just 6 years old, he had already learned how to navigate a world where people like him were seen, but never truly noticed. He lived in a small apartment with his mother, who worked tirelessly to make ends meet. Every morning, he watched her lace up her worn-out sneakers before heading to one of her many jobs, always leaving him with the same reminder: be smart, be careful, and always do what's right. The house next door, though, was nothing like his. It was a towering mansion, wrapped in white fences, with a driveway long enough to fit all the cars Malik had ever seen in his life. The family that lived there was rich, really rich. He didn't know exactly what they did, only that the father wore suits that never seemed to wrinkle, and the mother always smelled like flowers and expensive things. To them, Malik was just the boy next door. Sometimes, when his mother brought him along while she cleaned houses, he would sit quietly on their back porch, pretending not to listen to the things they said. He had learned long ago that the rich spoke in a different way, as if the world bent to their will. He wasn't jealous of them, not exactly. But he was aware of the invisible wall that separated his life from theirs, a wall made of things like money, power, and the belief that people like him would never belong. But none of that mattered to Malik. He wasn't interested in their money or their status. What did interest him, however, was the nanny, Jessica. From the moment he met her, something about her made his skin crawl. She was always smiling in front of the parents, always speaking in that soft, sweet voice when they were around. But when they weren't, Malik saw the way she changed. She was impatient, cold, and rough with the family's baby, Lucas, a child barely a year old, still wobbling on unsteady legs, still learning how to form words. Jessica was supposed to take care of him, but Malik had seen how she yanked his tiny arms when no one was looking, how she muttered under her breath when he cried, how she rolled her eyes instead of comforting him. Malik had seen it all, but seeing was one thing. Saying something, that was different. He was just a kid. And not just any kid, a kid from outside their world. Would they even listen to him? One afternoon, as Malik sat in his usual spot near the fence that separated their yards, he heard something that made his stomach twist. A sharp thud. Then silence. Then a muffled cry. Malik froze, his small hands gripping the edge of the fence as he peeked through the wooden slats. Inside the house, through the glass doors, he saw Jessica standing over Lucas, who had fallen onto the floor, his tiny hands reaching up, tears streaming down his red cheeks. But Jessica didn't pick him up. She didn't soothe him or tell him everything was okay. She glared at him. "Get up," she hissed under her breath. "Stop crying." Lucas wailed louder. Malik's heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to look away, wanted to pretend he hadn't seen anything, but he couldn't, because the way Jessica was looking at the baby, the hatred in her eyes, wasn't normal. Malik had spent his whole life learning how to read people. His mother always told him, "You have to pay attention to the world around you, baby. It'll keep you safe." And in that moment, everything inside him screamed that Lucas wasn't safe. Jessica bent down, her hands tightening into fists. Malik shot up from where he was sitting. "Hey!" His voice came out louder than he expected. Jessica's head snapped toward him, her eyes narrowing. Malik could feel his heart slamming against his ribs, but he didn't back down. He stepped forward, pressing his small hands against the fence. "I saw what you did," he said, his voice firm. Jessica straightened, her fake, pleasant smile curling back onto her face. "Oh, Malik," she said sweetly, but he could hear the sharpness underneath. "What are you talking about?" He wasn't stupid. He knew she was trying to scare him, trying to make him doubt himself. But Malik knew what he saw. "You pushed him," Malik accused. "You hurt him." Jessica's smile faltered. For a moment, there was silence. Then she took a slow step forward, lowering her voice. "Listen, kid," she whispered. "You don't know what you're talking about. And even if you did, who do you think they'd believe?" Malik clenched his fists. He knew what she meant. He knew. But he also knew that if he walked away now, if he let this moment pass, he might never get another chance. He had a choice. He could stay quiet, pretend he hadn't seen anything, let Jessica keep hurting Lucas while the rich parents remained blissfully unaware. Or he could do what was right. Taking a deep breath, Malik turned on his heel and sprinted toward the front of the house. "Where do you think you're going?" Jessica hissed after him. But Malik didn't stop. He ran up the front steps and banged his small fist against the grand wooden door. The parents had to listen to him. They had to, because for the first time in his life, Malik wasn't just an outsider. He was the only person who could save Lucas. Malik had always known that the world around him worked in a way that left little room for boys like him. At just 6 years old, he had already learned how to be careful, how to observe without being seen, how to move quietly in places where he was not always welcome. His mother told him he was special, that his sharp mind and kind heart would take him far. But, even as a child, Malik understood that some doors were never meant to open for people like him. He lived with his family in a small but loving home just outside the gated estates of the wealthiest families in town. His mother worked tirelessly as a housekeeper, cleaning the very mansions that towered over their neighborhood like castles, while his father worked shifts at a factory, always coming home late, smelling of metal and exhaustion. Malik often tagged along with his mother when she worked, sitting on back porches or playing quietly in corners while she scrubbed and dusted, making everything shine for people who barely acknowledged her presence. The family next door was one of the wealthiest in the area. Their house was enormous, with glass windows so clean they sparkled in the sun, a pool so large it seemed like a small ocean, and cars that looked like they had never touched dirt. The father was a businessman, always traveling, and the mother spent her time at charity events, dressed in expensive clothes while speaking about helping the less fortunate, though she had never once acknowledged Malik's existence. The only people in the house who spoke to him were the workers, the gardeners, the drivers, the housekeepers, who knew what it meant to live on the edges of wealth without ever being a part of it. And then, of course, there was Jessica. Jessica was the family's nanny, a tall, thin woman with cold blue eyes and a sharp voice that softened only when the parents were around. She carried herself with an air of superiority, as if looking after the baby, Lucas, made her important, as if caring for a rich child gave her power. From the very first time Malik met her, he had felt something was off. It wasn't just the way she ignored him, brushing past him like he was invisible, or the way she spoke to his mother in clipped, dismissive tones. It was something deeper, something in the way her smile never reached her eyes. Malik had learned to watch people carefully. He noticed things that others missed, little shifts in body language, the tension in a person's voice when they were pretending to be something they weren't. And what he noticed most about Jessica was how different she was when no one else was looking. She was good at hiding it. In front of the parents, she was all sweetness and warmth, cooing over baby Lucas, making sure his tiny socks matched his outfits, gently rocking him to sleep. But when they weren't around, when the house was quiet and empty, her patience thinned. Her hands were too rough, her words too sharp. Malik had seen her yank Lucas's arm too hard when he wouldn't stop crying. He had heard her hiss under her breath, "Why won't you just shut up?" He had watched her let him cry longer than necessary, her face blank with irritation. At first, Malik had told himself he was imagining things. Maybe she was just tired. Maybe he was reading too much into it. After all, what did he know about rich people and their ways? But the more he watched, the more he was sure. Jessica wasn't just impatient. She was cruel. One afternoon, while Malik sat in his backyard, drawing in the dirt with a stick, he heard it, the sound that made his stomach twist. A baby's scream, not a fussy whimper, not the usual cries of hunger or sleepiness. This was different. This was fear. Malik froze, his small hands tightening around the stick. His ears perked up, straining to hear. Then came Jessica's voice, sharp and low. "I said stop crying." Another wail. A thud. Malik's heart pounded as he scrambled to his feet, creeping toward the fence that separated his yard from theirs. He pressed his small fingers against the wooden slats, peering through a crack. Inside the house, through the sliding glass doors, he saw Jessica standing over Lucas, her face twisted with frustration. The baby was on the floor, his tiny arms outstretched, his face red and tear-streaked. Malik couldn't see exactly what had happened, but he knew one thing for certain. Lucas hadn't fallen on his own. Jessica's hands were clenched into fists, her jaw tight as she stared down at the crying child. Then, slowly, she bent down and picked him up, not with tenderness, but with a firm grip, her fingers digging into his small body. "You're fine," she muttered through gritted teeth. "Stop being such a brat." Malik felt his breath hitch. His mother had always told him that babies cried because they didn't have words yet, because they didn't know how to ask for what they needed. She had never, ever called a baby a brat. She had never hurt one. His stomach churned as he watched Jessica pace the room, bouncing Lucas a little too hard, her movements jerky and irritated. The baby's cries only grew louder. Malik knew he couldn't stay quiet. His mother had always told him to be careful, to mind his place. But she had also taught him something else. Doing what's right is more important than being afraid. He took a deep breath, stepping back from the fence. Jessica thought no one saw her. She thought no one would believe a boy like him if he spoke up. But she was wrong, because Malik had seen everything, and he wasn't going to let it go. Malik had always been quiet, always careful. He knew how to move unnoticed, how to listen without being heard, how to see things that others ignored. But now, that skill had turned into something more than just a survival tactic. Now, it was a responsibility. He couldn't forget what he had seen, Jessica's cold expression as she shook the baby, the way her voice turned sharp and cruel when no one else was around. It replayed in his head like a song stuck on repeat, each memory clearer than the last. He didn't need to convince himself that it was wrong. He knew it was. The problem was he also knew that no one would believe him. What was he supposed to do? Walk up to the baby's parents and tell them their perfect nanny was hurting their child? A 6-year-old black boy accusing a white woman who worked for one of the richest families in town. He had seen the way people looked at him. how they talked down to his mother, how they pretended not to see his father when he walked past them in his work uniform. But Malik also knew that if he stayed silent, Lucas would keep suffering, and that wasn't something he could live with. So he watched. He listened. He waited. For the next few days, Malik made sure to be nearby whenever Jessica was alone with the baby. He hid behind bushes, stood just outside open windows, pretended to play in the yard while keeping his ears sharp. He saw her slap Lucas's tiny hands when he knocked over a cup. He heard her mutter, "You're so useless," when he cried too long. He watched her let him sit in a soiled diaper longer than she should have, ignoring his discomfort. Every time it happened, Malik's stomach twisted tighter, but he forced himself to stay still. They won't believe you unless you have proof. His mother always said that adults only listened when something was right in front of them, undeniable. So he waited, knowing the moment would come, knowing that soon Jessica would slip up in a way that even she couldn't talk her way out of. And then it happened. It was late in the afternoon. Malik sat on the back porch, pretending to tie his shoelaces as he listened through the open sliding door. Inside, Jessica was pacing with Lucas in her arms, bouncing him aggressively as he sobbed. "I said shut up," she snapped, shaking him once, twice. Malik felt his breath hitch. His hands curled into fists as he peeked through the door. Jessica was frustrated, her face twisted with exhaustion and anger. Malik didn't know why. Maybe she had a bad day, maybe she was just cruel. But what he did know was that Lucas's tiny body was jerking in her grasp, his cries now hoarse, his little fists grasping at the air. Malik had seen enough. He stood, his small frame stiff with determination, and stepped into the house. His heart pounded so loudly he could hear it in his ears, but he didn't let himself hesitate. "I know what you did." Jessica froze. For a moment, the only sound was Lucas's uneven sobs. Slowly, she turned to face him, her face pale, her grip on the baby tightening for just a second, before she forced a smile. "Malik," she said, her voice sickly sweet, the same voice she used when the baby's parents were home. "What are you talking about?" But Malik didn't blink, didn't flinch. "I saw you," he said, his voice steady. "I've been seeing you." Jessica's fake smile wavered. Her eyes flickered toward the doorway, as if checking to see if anyone else was there. Then she let out a short, dry laugh. "You don't know what you're talking about," she said, shifting Lucas to her other arm. "You're just a little boy." Malik clenched his fists tighter. "So is he." He nodded toward the baby. "But you still hurt him." Jessica's face hardened. "You need to leave," she said, her voice lower now, colder. "No." Malik lifted his chin, his small frame unmoving. "I'm telling." Jessica's breath hitched. For the first time, real fear flashed in her eyes. "Telling who?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Their mom." Jessica let out a shaky breath, stepping toward him. "Listen to me, Malik," she said, her voice slower now, measured. "You don't want to do that." "Yes, I do." Jessica's hands tightened around Lucas again. Malik saw it, the way her fingers dug into the baby's arm, how her eyes flickered with frustration, not fear. And that was the final confirmation he needed. Malik took a step back, then another. Then, without another word, he turned and ran toward the front of the house. Jessica's voice rang out behind him. "Malik!" But he didn't stop. He ran up the stairs, his small feet pounding against the expensive floors. He ran through the hallways, past the glittering chandeliers, past the paintings worth more money than he had ever seen. He ran straight to the baby's mother. Because for the first time in his life, Malik wasn't afraid of being ignored. This time, they had to listen. Malik's feet barely touched the floor as he sprinted down the long hallway. His heart pounded, but he didn't let himself slow down. He had never run through a house like this before. This wasn't a place where kids like him were allowed to move freely, but none of that mattered now. He skidded to a stop in front of the baby's mother, Mrs. Davenport, who stood in the dining room, sipping a glass of wine while talking on the phone. She barely noticed him at first, too absorbed in whatever conversation she was having. Malik didn't wait. He didn't know how much time he had before Jessica caught up to him. "Mrs. Davenport," he gasped, his small chest rising and falling quickly. "It's Jessica. She's hurting Lucas." The words felt heavier when spoken out loud. He had thought them so many times, had rehearsed them in his mind over and over. But now that they were out in the open, hanging in the air, he realized just how serious they were. Mrs. Davenport frowned, pulling the phone away from her ear. "Malik, what are you talking about?" she asked, her tone more annoyed than concerned. Malik stood firm. "I saw her. She shakes him when he cries. She yells at him. She hit his hands when he dropped something. She's hurting him." Mrs. Davenport blinked. For a moment, she just stared at him, as if the words didn't make sense. Then she let out a breathy laugh, shaking her head. "That's a very serious accusation," she said, as if she were speaking to a much younger child who didn't understand the weight of his own words. "Jessica has been with us for years. She's wonderful with Lucas." Malik felt his stomach drop. She didn't believe him. Of course she didn't. Jessica had built a perfect image of herself in front of these people. She was careful, calculated. She knew exactly how to behave when they were around, how to keep their trust, how to make herself seem irreplaceable. And Malik, he was just the housekeeper's kid. But he wasn't going to back down. "She's lying to you," Malik said, his voice steady despite the lump forming in his throat. "She's different when you're not here. She—" "Enough, Malik," Mrs. Davenport interrupted, rubbing her temple. "I don't know what game you're playing, but this is a very serious accusation to make." "She hurt him." Malik's voice rose, desperation creeping in. "Just look, right now. She's in the living room, he's crying, and she's hurting him." Mrs. Davenport sighed, clearly irritated. But something in Malik's face must have made her hesitate, because instead of brushing him off, she finally turned her head toward the living room, and then she heard it, a sharp, angry whisper. "Shut up, you little brat." The blood drained from Mrs. Davenport's face. She moved fast, faster than Malik had ever seen her move before. She stormed through the doorway, her heels clicking loudly against the polished floors. Malik followed right behind her, his heart slamming against his ribs. When they entered the room, Jessica was standing in the center, holding Lucas too tightly, her fingers pressing into his tiny arms. His face was red from crying, his small hands reaching out in distress. Jessica's expression was one of pure irritation, until she saw them. The moment she met Mrs. Davenport's eyes, her whole demeanor changed. "Mrs. Davenport," Jessica gasped, shifting Lucas into a more gentle position, forcing a wide, fake smile. "Oh, poor thing is just fussy today. He—" "Put him down." Mrs. Davenport's voice was low, trembling with anger. Jessica froze. I said put him down." Jessica slowly, carefully, placed Lucas back into his crib. He continued to wail, his little body shaking, but at least he was safe now. Mrs. Davenport took a deep breath, her hands balled into fists. "You lied to me." Jessica opened her mouth, but no words came out. "I trusted you," Mrs. Davenport went on, her voice rising with fury. "I left my son with you. And all this time you were—" Her voice broke, her eyes glistening with the weight of what she had just discovered. Then she turned to Malik. For the first time, she truly saw him. And the guilt hit her like a wave. She had doubted him. She had dismissed him, looked past him, assumed that his words carried no weight simply because of who he was. And she had been wrong. Her gaze snapped back to Jessica, now pale and stiff. "Get out!" Jessica's mouth opened and closed, like a fish gasping for air. "Mrs. Davenport, please, you don't understand." "I said get out!" Jessica flinched. For the first time, she wasn't the one in control. Tears welled up in her eyes as she realized that there was no way out of this. The truth was exposed. There was no more hiding, no more pretending. And then, the final blow. "I'm calling the police," Mrs. Davenport said. Jessica's whole body went rigid. Wait. But it was too late. The call was made. Within minutes, sirens echoed in the distance, growing louder with every second. Jessica turned to Malik, her eyes burning with something between anger and desperation. "You did this," she hissed. Malik didn't flinch. "You did it to yourself," he said simply. The front door burst open. Officers entered the house, and before Jessica could try to explain her way out of it, she was escorted away. The reality of her fate settled over the room, her lies, her cruelty, her power over Lucas, all crumbling into nothing. And Malik? He stood there, silent but steady, knowing that he had done what was right, knowing that for the first time someone had listened. The house was quieter now. The tension that had once suffocated it had lifted, but the weight of realization still lingered. Jessica was gone, escorted away in the flashing lights of a police car, her reign of cruelty over. Lucas, now safe in his mother's arms, had finally stopped crying. His tiny body relaxed for the first time in what felt like forever. But the aftermath of it all, the shame, the guilt, the reckoning, was just beginning. Malik stood near the doorway, unsure of what to do next. He had done what he came to do. He had told the truth, exposed the lie, and protected the baby who had no voice of his own. But what now? He wasn't expecting a thank you. He wasn't expecting anything. He had never been the kind of boy people rewarded for doing the right thing. But then, Mrs. Davenport turned to him. Her eyes were still red from crying. Her expensive blouse wrinkled from the way she had clutched Lucas to her chest. She looked at Malik in a way she never had before. Not as the housekeeper's son, not as the boy who lived next door, not as someone beneath her, but as something more. "I owe you an apology," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Malik blinked. "I didn't believe you," she continued. "Even when you were trying to save my son, I doubted you." She shook her head, the guilt clear on her face. "I let my own ignorance blind me. I let myself believe that because of who you are, because of where you come from, your words didn't matter." She swallowed hard, her grip on Lucas tightening. "But they did. You mattered." Malik shifted on his feet, unused to this kind of attention. "I just wanted to help," he said honestly. Mrs. Davenport let out a shaky breath, then looked past him to where his mother stood silent but watching. "We owe you both more than just words," Mr. Davenport said, stepping forward. He had been quiet through most of it, his face unreadable. But now there was something raw in his expression, something Malik had never seen from a man like him before. "Your family has worked for us for years. You've done everything for this house, for this family, and we've never really seen you." He paused. "That changes today." Malik looked up at him, confused. "We want to help," Mrs. Davenport said, "not just because of what you did today, but because it's the right thing to do. You and your family deserve better. We want to give you a place to stay, a real home, where you don't have to worry about making ends meet." Malik's mother stiffened. "Mr. Davenport, it's not charity," he interrupted. "It's justice. It's acknowledgement. And more than that, it's a debt we owe." He looked at Malik then, his eyes filled with something Malik couldn't quite place. "Your son risked everything to protect my child. If the world were fair, he would never have had to. But the world isn't fair, and that's why we want to do more." Malik's mother was silent for a long time. He knew she was proud. He knew she had raised him to stand up for what was right, to never let fear stop him from speaking the truth. But he also knew that people like the Davenports, people with money, with power, had never given them anything before. And yet, this time, it didn't feel like pity. It didn't feel like something handed to them out of guilt alone. It felt real. "We also want to give Malik a scholarship," Mrs. Davenport added. "A full one. A chance to go to the best schools, to have every opportunity that my own children have." She looked at Malik's mother, then at Malik. "He deserves it." Malik's chest tightened. A real school. Not the overcrowded, underfunded one he attended now. Not the place where teachers barely had time to notice him, where he was just another name on a long list of students expected to get by with whatever scraps of education they could manage. A real chance. His mother hesitated, but when she finally spoke, her voice was soft. This is a lot," she admitted. "I've worked my whole life expecting nothing from people like you." Mr. Davenport nodded. "I understand." She exhaled, then looked down at Malik. "What do you want?" Malik thought about it. Thought about everything that had happened. He had never wanted riches. He had never expected fairness. But now, standing in the ruins of a truth he had forced into the light, he realized something. He wanted more than just survival. He wanted a future. "I want to learn," he said finally. "I want to be somebody." His mother smiled then, soft, proud, knowing. Mrs. Davenport reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You already are." The shift didn't just stop with the Davenport family. Word spread quickly. The community, once indifferent to Malik and his family, now saw him in a different light. The boy they had ignored had become the boy they admired. The child they had assumed would never rise beyond his circumstances had shown more courage, more strength than the wealthiest among them. And with that realization came a change. People who had never given Malik a second glance now greeted him with respect. Teachers paid attention. Shopkeepers smiled instead of looking past him. It wasn't that he needed their approval. He had done what was right, regardless of who was watching. But knowing that he had changed their views, that he had forced them to confront their own biases, meant something. For the first time, Malik wasn't invisible. He wasn't just the housekeeper's son. He was the boy who had stood up, the boy who had saved a life, the boy who had made them see the truth. And as he walked out of that house, stepping into a world that finally saw him for who he truly was, Malik realized something. This wasn't the end of his story. It was only the beginning. The storm had passed, but the impact of Malik's bravery remained. What had started as a simple act of truth-telling had become something far greater, something that had shifted the lives of everyone involved. The house that once ignored him had been forced to listen. The people who once dismissed him had been made to see. and the family that once saw him as nothing more than the housekeeper's child now knew that he was far more than that. Malik had never set out to change anything. He had only wanted to do what was right, to make sure that Lucas was safe. But in speaking up, in refusing to be silenced, he had done something that not even he had expected. He had rewritten the future, not just for himself, but for everyone around him. Jessica had been taken away, her carefully built facade shattered in an instant. The truth was undeniable now, and the weight of her actions had caught up to her. No longer protected by the illusion of wealth and trust, she had been exposed for what she truly was, a person who had used power against those who could not defend themselves. And because of Malik, justice had found her at last. But justice was not just about punishing the guilty. It was also about acknowledging the innocent, about making things right where they had once gone wrong. That was why the Davenports had changed, not just in their actions, but in their understanding. They had seen their own blind spots, had realized how easily they had allowed themselves to be fooled. And more than that, they had seen Malik, not as an outsider, not as someone beneath them, but as someone worth listening to, someone worth respecting. For Malik, the change was both external and internal. He had never asked for recognition, had never expected gratitude. But for the first time in his life, he was not invisible. He was not just the quiet boy sitting on the sidelines.